task this morning is to talk to you about ways of engaging your students in thinking in a meaningful and connecting with the literature of the United States in the 19th century. And this can, be a somewhat, oh my goodness, this can be a somewhat kind of daunting task, in part because of all of the challenges that we face in our current moment. As you know, our students are living in a genuine time of crisis, not just COVID-19, but the kind of economic fallout that afflicts all of us. But your students are very likely less, they might regard the 19th century as, they might presume that it's kind of pointless or irrelevant, that has little meaning or value for their own lives, in part because our students are really focused on some of the challenges of the present moment. So many of your students are very likely ensconced at home. They're not able to go to school because of COVID, and because they're kind of lodged in some kind of a domestic environment, your students are very likely dealing with some of the complications of learning at home and dealing with their families or the people that they live with. Your students are very likely have some very real economic concerns in this moment. Your students may be worried that their parents have lost their jobs or may lose their jobs. Your students may be working part-time to help their families make ends meet. Your students may be really concerned about their own or their family's immigration status. They may really be worried about deportation. Your students are probably really concerned about such things as climate change. They're worried about their own kind of economic and their future prospects. And many of your students are, I would hope, really engaged and involved in the activist movements that are really enlivening kind of American culture in this particular moment. So all of this is to say that your students are probably really focused on the present, and they're probably really worried about the future. And so they're probably going to be really reluctant to kind of return to the literature of the American past. And so you're going to kind of grapple with some resistance, in part because I think our students often have an erroneous or mistaken kind of understanding of the 19th century, in part because of your students' kind of lack of historical knowledge, in part because of kind of misconceptions or representations, images in the media, in film and in television. Students often think of the 19th century as this kind of idyllic, simpler time when the world was an easier place, when many of the problems that afflict our students are like nowhere in sight. And so the 19th century may seem like a kind of irrelevant and pointless place for them to study and dwell on. But I do think that it's important for us, all of us as teachers of literature, to combat our students' misapprehensions and misunderstandings of the 19th century. And I think it's important to kind of communicate to them that the 19th century has much more in common with our own moment than your students might necessarily suspect. And as all of you know, as teachers, that one of the wonderful challenges of teaching literature to adolescents is their adolescence, right? Adolescent development is a really interesting, it's a really difficult time, but as you know, adolescents developmentally tend to be pretty self-involved. They have a really kind of narrow purview, a narrow kind of window, although that is certainly changing because of social media. But I would suggest that one way of combating student resistance or reluctance or misapprehension about the 19th century is perhaps to lean into or really leverage, really play up to your students' own self-involvement and really kind of drill down into and focus on some of the aspects of American contemporary life that you might see originating in the 19th century. So in other words, you might want to really lean into the concerns of our present moment, the distractions of our present moment, and use these aspects of modern contemporary life and use them as a point of access into the literature of the 19th century. And in so doing, you can show your students a kind of the ways in which many of the controversies, many of the challenges of our own current moment originate in the 19th century. And the literature of the 19th century, this image that I have for you, it gives a kind of idealized image of the 19th century, a young woman in a bonnet reading. This is often what your students think of when they think of the 19th century, but I think it's important to remind students that things were not better or simpler at all in the 19th century. If anything, I don't want to say they were worse, but they were things that was not an idyllic or simpler time at all. So I encourage you to use the 19th century as a way of maybe teaching your students the history of our own current moment, and to show them how many of the debates that surround us, they were already raging 200 years ago. And many of the, much of the literature of the 19th century documents and evidences some of these preoccupations that frame your students and their lives. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples, but really it's a kind of infinite list. We might think of, that we are in some ways living in an extraordinary and unprecedented moment. I saw in the New York Times the other day an article that contended that Black Lives Matter is actually the most popular protest movement in world history, just by sheer numbers of people who have been involved in this movement. But you might remind students that many of the kind of activism of our own moment, many of the activist movements that frame and inflect our lives were already raging 200 years ago. We're already kind of lively subjects of debate and activism a very long time ago. And so I'll give you sort of later in my talk, I'll give you some examples of writers that and texts that might be useful to you in exploring some of the 19th century literary origins of our own present moment. But you might remind students that activism, that we saw activism on advocacy for racial equality and gender equality. These things were already very lively subjects of interest in the 19th century. And many of the major writers and minor writers of the 19th century had real skin in the game. They were really involved in these movements and often wrote about them in ways that are visible and less visible. We are, as you know, living in a period of really virulent anti-immigrant sentiment. And this is, really brought home to us in Texas, and many of your students are kind of living this antipathy for immigrants and descendants of immigrants. But you might remind your students that the rhetoric of our current moment is already visible, fully formed by the 19th century. The language, the debates, the discourse, the anti-immigrant discourse is not new to our own moment, but has very clear antecedents and origins in the 19th century. These images I have, they're from, I think, New York from the very late 19th century when, as you know, millions of immigrants were coming to the United States from Europe. But you might remind students that, in fact, debates about immigration really kind of run throughout the 19th century. And you might, for instance, it might be fruitful for you to ask your students to think about the 1840s, which is a less remembered moment of really ugly anti-immigrant sentiment when, the United States, when really many Irish immigrants were coming to the United States in the 1840s. And there was a great deal of outspoken antipathy and outright racism that opposed Irish immigration. And this might be an interesting place for you to look with your students, in part because this moment in the 1840s kind of challenges what we think we know about the kind of linkages of race with anti-immigration. So that's just another example. It might also be fruitful for you to remind students that concerns and anxieties about the environment, about climate change, were already rampant in the 19th century. The 19th century is the era of deforestation, of development, of urbanization and mechanization, of industry, where we see like mass pollution, where we see communities really kind of turned upside down because of changes in industry and so forth. We also know that observers recognize that the climate was already beginning to change by the late 19th century because of the reliance on fossil fuels. So again, you might remind students that, and we'll talk about this in a minute, that these concerns really lay just beneath the surface in much 19th century writing about the natural world. You might also remind, many of your students are kind of in touch with really kind of fruitful and interesting public discourse about gender, about sexuality. Many of your students are very likely kind of reflecting on their own gender and sexuality. They are maybe thinking about, or they might know people who identify as non-binary, people who are sort of thinking about themselves as possibly trans. We might think that these debates about gender and sexuality are completely modern and new, but the 19th century reminds us that they are in fact not. That many of the texts of the 19th century, we can see these issues getting played out very clearly in 19th century American literature. And by way of illustration, I just point to one example that is probably familiar to many of you, and that is Louisa May Alcott's novel, Little Women, which I know many of you read. And I think for many of us, reading Little Women in our youth is probably what set us on a course to become teachers of literature. But many of your students have probably read Little Women, but many of them are familiar with Little Women because of the film that came out last year. But I'll remind you that for the first half of the novel, Jo March really identifies as a trans man. Jo March wants to be called by a man's name. Jo March wears men's clothes. Jo March identifies as the, quote, man of the family. And we see, anyway, so this is just like one very visible kind of notable example where we can see some 19th century traces and the history of some really important aspects of our own current moment, and that are very likely really pressing aspects of your students' lives that your students are really reflecting on, and that might kind of color and filter their engagement with the 19th century. So you might remind them that you've got a lot more in common with the 19th century than you might realize. Just to give you, so I think one way of asking your students or inviting your students to engage in the 19th century is really, it's all in the framing. How we invite our students to kind of understand the 19th century. It can seem very foreign. It can seem very unfamiliar. It can seem to be, just light years away from the worlds that our students inhabit. But I think if you kind of package these texts in a way that bridges the gap between our moment and the past, it might help students see the 19th century as a kind of intellectual history of their own lives and their own moment. So I have for you an image, Thomas Cole's very famous painting, The Oxbow, a famous painting from the Hudson River School of the second quarter of the 19th century. And so often when we teach the 19th century, we end up kind of showing our students images or reading texts that depict the natural world in a state of like unblemished, idyllic perfection. And that for students can seem very foreign and alien. You might package these images and these texts, these portraits of an idealized natural world. You might sort of suggest to students that there's already, that these images and these texts emerge out of a 19th century recognition that the natural world is already in danger, that it's already very rapidly disappearing, that it's already, being deforested, that its resources are being extracted. There's already a very keen sense that the natural world is in danger, and we often see these these images and these literary texts really attempting to try to kind of preserve a natural world that is very rapidly disappearing. So in other words, you might frame these texts and these images less as a kind of snapshot of a world that is long disappeared, but as efforts to manage environmental anxiety. That these texts are already, or these texts and these images are already very nostalgic, and they're already kind of unfamiliar to residents of the United States in the 19th century. So again, you might want to package these things so that students can see that these texts and these images are an attempt to address very familiar modern problems of environmental anxiety and devastation. Another example is, a lot of the literature in the 19th century, especially a lot of the literature that is designed for female readers, young female readers like your students. A lot of the literature earmarked for young female readers in the 19th century are about courtship. They're about courtship, dating, what we might call dating and courtship, and then, the kind of process by which a young woman makes decisions about the future that she wants to have, what she makes decisions about the adult life that she wants to have for herself. These sorts of narratives, we call them marriage plots, these sorts of courtship texts, well, on the one hand, they're enormously pleasurable. And you might remind your students that these sorts of texts, they are the foundation of every romantic comedy. They are the foundation of every romance novel. Like, all of these narratives about courtship, they come right out of this 19th century prototype of the marriage plot. These things might seem to have like no relevance at all to your students, but you might package these things and tell your students that these kinds of courtship narratives, they were designed for young female readers, just like your students, but they were designed to teach your young female readers what not to do. They were designed to help and educate young female readers how to execute good judgment in their dealings with men, how to exercise restraint, the dangers of engaging in extramarital sex. These texts were designed to kind of educate young female readers. And you might tell your students that, that things for young women in the 19th century were significantly more grievous and dire than they are today. For a middle class or an elite woman, having sex out of wedlock was often depicted as literally fatal in the 19th century. And so if you teach your students these kinds of, writings about courtship or marriage, and some of them include things like Pride and Prejudice or Little Women, there are just, there are countless examples. You might ask your students to consider what lessons young female readers were supposed to glean from these texts. What are the lessons here? What are young female readers supposed to learn to do and what not to do? So all of this is to say is that, again, you might, the courtship narratives of the 19th century, they might seem really antiquated to us. We're like, the great drama is like, who asked me to dance at the party? But you might communicate to students that these texts were designed, they articulate the very real limits available to young women, the very few options that young women had in this period. But you might ask your students to consider how these texts were designed pedagogically. They were designed to teach young women what to do and what not to do. And again, you might ask your students to kind of reflect on like what kinds of qualities do these texts encourage? What do they dissuade? Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to talk about some specific things you might try in your classrooms to try to engage students in the literature of the 19th century. And for all of these different items you'll see I have here, I've included the kind of the Texas state guidelines, just so you can see, the different curricular elements that I've tried, that are being satisfied with some of the things that I suggest here. So one thing you might communicate to students is students often imagine that the things that they value, the things that contemporary American life values, are evergreen. You know, readers and Americans have always valued. And you might try to communicate to your students that 19th century readers they valued different things, and they had different practices of reading. I remind my students in all of my classes that the 19th century readers, they didn't necessarily value what we value. I remind them that really poetry was the most popular reading for common people in the 19th century, that we think today of poetry as a kind of elite, rarefied, kind of fancy literary mode that is inaccessible. But I like to remind my students that, in fact, that was not how poetry was received in the 19th century. That poetry was very, very popular in the 19th century, that people just read it for pleasure. I also remind my students that novels, right, these absorbing, gripping narratives that we all love, that in fact novels were regarded with great suspicion in the 19th century. That novels today are perfectly respectable, like everybody's reading groups, they all read novels. But in the 19th century, there was a lot of concern that novels were basically regarded as trashy. They were regarded as suspicious. There was a great deal of concern that the reading of novels could again prove fatal to impressionable young female readers. They were kind of like, you know, what video games were like 20, 30 years ago. There was a lot of concern that, you know, if you allow your children to play video games, they will become, you know, school shooters. But there was a lot of public debate about the dangers of novel reading in the 19th century. So I like to ask my students, it might be fruitful to ask your students, why were novels regarded as dangerous to young women? What are the dangers of novel reading? Again, sort of contextualize these things, and then you might sort of probe and try to ask your students to reflect on, you know, why 19th century readers may have had these responses. So as I mentioned earlier, poetry is often very foreign and intimidating for students. And I still, you know, even at the college level, I still encounter this. Often poetry feels, you know, it feels like often our students presume that the understanding and the appreciation for poetry requires a whole like range of specialized knowledge that they don't have. Poetry often, they presume, uses a really kind of elevated mode of language that might seem inaccessible to them. But what I try to do is I try to, again, and I encourage you to do this as well, try to make poetry accessible and approachable. You know, I remind students that, and this sometimes backfires, but I remind students that 19th century readers didn't generally read poetry the way we read it in our classroom. You know, we in our classroom, we often do things like we scan, we look for meter, we talk about, you know, form and rhyme scheme and different genres of poetry. We often, you know, really kind of subject poetry to this kind of rigorous formal analysis. But I remind my students that readers in the 19th century didn't necessarily do that. You know, readers didn't go through these interpretive exercises. They read it and they enjoyed it. And they read it out loud to each other. So again, I try to remind my students of these things to make poetry feel more accessible and approachable. So another thing you might try, and this might work maybe better for younger students. I know there are some people here who are, you know, teachers of middle school students. This might work especially well for middle school students, but you might try to imitate 19th century reading practices with your students. And so by which I mean, you know, today we think of reading as a solitary and silent practice. You know, something you do by yourself in quiet. And that's maybe one of the reasons why our students often, you know, just are not particularly attracted to reading. But I remind my students that while many people read in solitude and in silence in the 19th century, often reading was undertaken in a completely different manner in the 19th century. People in the 19th century read collectively. They read together and they read out loud. People read lots of different genres and media together. For sure, people shared letters. They would read letters to each other. They would share them within the family. They would read newspapers together. They would read poetry. They would read essays and some fiction, right? Remember, fiction was kind of déclassé. But they would often read together and they would read out loud. So I think that this can be a useful, you might want to experiment with this and frame it as like, we're going to experiment with 19th century reading practices and see what happens. I do think that, you know, whenever possible, I think especially when you teach poetry, I think it's really important to ask your students to read the poems out loud together in class. So for instance, like one thing you might do is, and I also, one other reason why I like to do this is have allowed reading in class is it allows maybe your more quiet students to kind of get used to hearing their own voice in class as a way of kind of engaging your less vocal students. It's a way to kind of, you know, get them to participate in class. But you might do something like, you know, if you've not, you know, if you've assigned something other than poetry, you might begin class by asking one student to kind of summarize the text. You might ask another student to kind of, you know, begin discussion, and I do this, begin discussion by asking students to kind of tell you their responses to the text, just to kind of open up class discussion. But if you, again, I think whenever you read poetry, you should always ask students to read it out loud, just because they can engage the poem in a different way if they hear it with their ears rather than just seeing it with their eyes. What I also often like to do is ask students to read different stanzas. You know, if it's a poem with 4 stanzas, I'll ask for 4 students to, so you get a range of people to read. If you're reading a long poem, what I really enjoy doing, so when I teach Poe's The Raven, I just like go up and down the rows in the classroom. Like everybody takes a stanza, you know, go up the row and down the row, just so everybody gets a chance. I recognize that students have different learning styles. They may be self-conscious about reading aloud. So I always tell my students that for whatever reason, they can just say pass, you know, if they don't want to read that day. But again, you sort of might want to sort of engage in collective oral reading practices as a way of kind of connecting with your students. But if you ask your students to share their opinions of 19th century texts, you better be prepared for some not terribly receptive responses. Students are often going to say, like, I don't get it, it's boring, it didn't make any sense, it's confusing. And I actually really believe in taking those responses seriously. I feel like, you know, when you begin class and say, so what did you think about this essay by Emerson? They are going to say, I have no idea what he's talking about. I have no idea, this makes no sense. And I like to use those moments as a great learning opportunity. I like to, you know, get students to trust their own reading instincts. And I like to use those moments as an opportunity to kind of drill down into the text and try to get the students to articulate what in the text produced this response to them. What in the text makes it boring? Like, what specifically in the writing made this thing boring? What specifically in the writing made it difficult for you to understand? And that allows students to kind of get a more detailed understanding of the kind of rhetorical operations of the text. So for instance, you know, when I teach Emerson, and I love, but my students say, I have no idea what he's talking about. I ask them, like, what specifically in Emerson contributed to this response? And lots of stuff comes up, but my students will say, like, it'll come up that, for instance, Emerson's essays lack clear signposting and transitional sentences, right? Emerson does not know how to begin a paragraph. He doesn't know how to write a paragraph, but I love him nonetheless. He also doesn't know how to punctuate, but anyway. But Emerson's writing lacks these clear transitional sentences that help orient the reader. And so then once it becomes clear that, like, we figured out what makes his writing confusing, I then try to use that as a lesson for my students about their own writing, right? So this class is what happens when you, as writers, omit clear transitional sentences. So again, I try to take the responses seriously as a way of fostering more careful, attentive reading, and also as a way of generating some lessons about their own writing. So I often ask students to create commonplace books. So commonplacing was a system of note-taking. Everybody did it, really, from antiquity all the way through the 19th century, and some of us still do it. It's a way of taking notes, and everybody did it. It was just people would just write notable quotations from their reading, quotations that they wished to preserve. And it's a really interesting way of teaching your student, and you can find images of commonplace books online. Lots and lots of archives have digitized commonplace books. So Harvard's Houghton Library has digitized lots and lots of commonplace books. You can see the commonplace books of really famous writers. And it's just a way of getting students to take notes. They just write down quotations that they find significant or noteworthy. And it was supposed to foster more attentive, more careful reading in young students, the same age as your students. But you might ask your students to keep a commonplace book. It doesn't have to necessarily be a kind of fancy journal. It can just be a piece of paper. It can be a Google Doc. And it's, and then you might, once your students have kept a commonplace book, they're imitating 19th century reading practices, you might ask them to kind of reflect on, either in class or in writing, about some of the patterns that they notice in their own commonplace book. Ask them, sort of like, what kinds of things, what have you learned about yourself? What have you learned about your own taste from the kinds of quotations that you have selected here? I'll also mention that 19th century teenagers commonly exchanged commonplace books with their close friends. It was a form of like intimacy, where you would it was like sharing your journal with a close friend. So you might consider, and this again, I think this might work for younger students, but you might ask your students to swap their commonplace books with a peer in the class, and then try to kind of analyze, see if they can notice any patterns in their peers' collections of quotations. Another thing that you might do is really try to lean into the foreignness and the unfamiliarity of 19th century literature. You might ask your students to do a little research into the historical and social contexts that frame some of the readings. So I notice, that many of us might be a little bit anxious about teaching historical texts, that we might feel like we don't necessarily have the background to teach some of these texts. You might want to make your students do some of that work, kind of engage them in the process of trying to contextualize some of the readings. So you might do something like, break your class up into groups, and, depending on how you feel about group work, and ask them. So you might, throughout your syllabus, assign different student groups or different students to research some of the social and historical contexts of these texts, and then ask them to present their findings to the class as a whole. Again, this might be a way to engage your students into the history. It might allow your students to get some kind of ownership and investment in the literature of the past. And you can give them very particular assignments. So for instance, if your students are reading Huck Finn, you might ask your students to do some research on Twain's own attitude toward race, Twain's attitude toward slavery, Twain's attitude toward the antebellum South, Twain's attitude. You're with me on this. You can give them very particular assignments. Instead of just say, research the history of something, you can give them a very particular thing that you want them to research, and then let your students do some of that work in contextualizing these texts for their peers. And in a similar vein, you might want to think about history as the secondary subject here in your classroom. If you're teaching the 11th grade, very likely your students are also learning American history at the same time. And so you might want to consider trying to collaborate with your colleagues who were teaching American history to your students. So very likely when you're teaching early American literature, your peers in history are probably also teaching early American history. So you might want to think about ways of collaborating with them and creating readings or assignments or presentations kind of in tandem across English and history. One other thing that I really like to do in my kind of introductory American literature classes is to treat historical documents, historical texts, as literary texts. So in my survey of American literature, we spend a couple of days reading the Declaration of Independence. We read Thomas Jefferson's kind of original draft, and we think about it as a literary text. We think about, I get my students to talk about Jefferson's style. He has a very distinctive and I think very interesting style. We talk about the kind of organization of the Declaration. We talk about some of the rhetorical decisions that are made in the document. Also, if you read the kind of original draft, that is also a great opportunity to talk to your students about the importance of revision. It's really interesting to show your students both Jefferson's draft and the later version that was approved by the Continental Congress. And you can see the passages that were edited out. This is in the Norton Anthology. It's widely available. And again, you can talk to your students about revision and editing. So again, sort of you might want to think about historical documents as a worthy subject of close literary analysis. In a similar vein, you might ask your students to do a little research into the context of some text publications. We think that if you think that media is partisan today, boy, you should take a look at the 19th century. In the 19th century, boy, newspapers and magazines were expressly associated with particular political parties, as were magazines and journals. So, newspapers and magazines were expressly partisan. So it might be worthwhile for you to, again, assign your students either individually or in groups the task of conducting a little bit of research into the publication contexts of some of the texts that you're writing or reading, sorry. You might ask students to, you might want to ask them to look and learn a little bit about the author's lives. Your students might be able to find some letters or some writings that these writers, you might also ask your students to research reviews of some of these 19th century texts, and then ask them to consider what sorts of biases and values they see in these 19th century receptions. So again, this is a very, this is just an extension of what I've just said. You might ask your students to, like if you're reading, I'm thinking like The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, you might ask students to do a little research and learn a little bit more about the author's lives. Share some of that burden, share some of that responsibility with your students. And that might give them a little bit more kind of investment and ownership over these 19th century figures. And it might allow your students to recognize that these writers' lives were much more similar to their own than they might necessarily think at first glance. You might also ask students to rewrite some texts from a modern perspective. This might be, you do this as part of a scaffolded assignment. You might want to pick a text, maybe like the Declaration. You might want to read trying to think of some other historical documents like, Lincoln's second inaugural address, or pick some text, and then ask students to kind of work together with your students to pinpoint some literary qualities that you see, like what are the distinctive literary traits here or stylistic signatures that you see this writer using? How does this writer typically kind of build a sentence? What are some tics that you see? And then you might ask students to imitate those texts, right? Write texts that address modern issues, but maybe try to use these writers' styles. And I'll just point out that 19th century students, really until the very early 20th century, most students through history learned to write through imitation, through imitating exemplary models. And you might tell your students that you're going to try this. You're going to try to teach them to write the way 19th century students did. So get your students together with your students, work to pinpoint some distinctive literary qualities or hallmarks of writers, and then ask them to rewrite a text about a modern issue, but using this writer's style. So again, you might want to lean into some similarities to contemporary American life. If you're reading The Scarlet Letter, you might want to talk to your students about the culture of bullying, the culture of exclusion. You might want to talk to your students about the ways in which cultures vilify and demonize women who exercise, their sexuality. Talk to your students in ways that really kind of amplify a text similarities to their own life. You might want to talk about, again, so really try to kind of, play up to or accentuate your students' own experiences and try to show how these texts, in fact, address issues that are very similar to problems that your own students are grappling with. And so my final suggestion is maybe consider allowing students to choose their own reading. So again, not for the whole year or the whole semester, but you might create like a module or a unit where you're grappling with something and give your students a kind of range of texts that they might choose from. And then, you might want to choose texts that are available, free texts that are available in digitized electronic form or that are available through the library. But give your, you might create like a little unit on a kind of theme and give them a kind of limited list and then allow your students to choose a text that, again, might give them a sense of ownership and investment in 19th century texts. So I've created for you just a couple of potential modules that you might use to engage students. So I created a little list of 19th century novels, American novels that really grapple with social problems. And I'm sure, Sarah and I can sort of generate lots and lots of other potential names, but this is just a kind of draft of some novels that you might, that are free, that are available, and you might ask your students to maybe work together, work in groups, give a presentation to the class, something like that. But maybe this is for older students, allow them a little bit of independence in doing their own reading in 19th century texts. This is a list of 19th century poets who also grappled with social problems. We often think about poetry as a kind of aloof from modern life, but that was not the case then and now. This is just a draft list of a bunch of poets who were really popular and important, but who overtly grapple with major social problems. And again, you might ask your students to pick a poet and do a little bit of reading. All of their stuff is available online for free, and then ask them to do a little bit of research and maybe give a presentation to the class. You might also have like a Black Lives Matter cluster. And this is just a list of writers from the 18th century all the way up to through the 19th century. Some major figures who work in lots of different genres, who wrote poetry, who wrote novels, who wrote memoir, who were orators, used lots and lots of different forms. And you might ask your students to kind of pick a writer and do some research into these students' writing and lives. It seems like February, right? Black History Month might be an opportune occasion to do this, but I actually want to dissuade you from doing that. I often feel like, African-American literature and Black history are American literature and American history. I feel like, we should be reluctant to kind of segregate this study for a particular month, but I would say like integrate this throughout the entire academic year. And I think that's all I've got. So thank you so much.